Texas in 1875 carried the heat of red earth, the dry wind circling, as if nothing in this place was soft enough to shelter a young woman. Talia Reed walked the main road of Dustwell with worn canvas shoes, her back kept straight. She had long lost the right to choose weakness. Her mother died when she was 15, leaving her in a cramped house with Vernon Reed, drunk, restless, and never free of debt. Talia held a bundle of freshly washed sheets from the Dustwell Inn. The water was never clear, the soap never fragrant, but 50 cents a day kept her from starving. A gunshot cracked from the saloon. She flinched but kept moving. In Dustwell, gunfire was like wind, heard by all, questioned by none. Passing the saloon doors, a group of cowboys smelling of smoke turned to look. One slurred, "Look there, Texas wildflower walking by." She stared ahead. Her mother once said silence spared trouble. Her steps faltered only when another man whistled and took a step toward her. Before he added another word, a voice cut in, low, steady, edged with quiet steel. "Enough." Talia glanced over and saw Samuel Barrett for the first time. He leaned against a post, the brim of his hat casting most of his face in shadow, leaving only the cold, gray eyes clear as a winter gust. There was nothing loud in that look, only a silence that made men step back. The cowboy scoffed but turned away. In this region, a few men didn't need a drawn gun to command distance. Barrett was one of them. Talia gave a small nod. He tipped his hat in reply, not lingering, not calling her back. A moment passed, then each went on. But her heart, long shaped by fear, felt a brief, unfamiliar ease. That night she returned home to find the door thrown open, as if by wind. Vernon Reed stumbled inside, breath thick with whiskey. One look at his bloodshot eyes told her enough. "Luther Briggs, I lost $500, he muttered, digging through empty pockets as if a miracle might fall out. Talia stepped back. $500 was a lifetime. "What are you planning to do?" His stare cut like a dull blade. "Luther says there's a way to settle it." A dark certainty sank through her. Near midnight she was dragged from bed, hair still loose. In the dim lamplight 4 men waited. Orson Pike, the saloon owner, Luther Briggs, a widower with a soft belly, and last, Samuel Barrett. She froze at the sight of him. The frustration on his face made clear he had not known why he'd been called. Vernon pushed her forward like stock at market. 18. Works like a man. Cooks, sews, don't complain. Pike let out a slow grin. She'd suit my saloon fine. Quiet type sells well. Briggs stroked his chin. Send her to New Mexico. Higher price there. Talia's legs stayed locked, rooted by fear. Samuel stood behind them, fists tight. He said nothing, but his anger wasn't directed at her. It was at all of this. Briggs tapped the table. "Start at 500. Who's bidding?" Pike called first. 550. 600. 7. 8. Each number landed like a whip. Silence followed. Then a clear voice from the far end. 1,000. Talia looked up. Samuel Barrett met Briggs's stare without blinking. "But on one condition." Briggs narrowed his eyes. "Say it." "She chooses. I pay off the debt. I don't buy a person." The room stilled. All eyes moved to Talia. For the first time in years, something opened. A narrow door, but hers. Samuel stepped closer, enough that she heard his steady breath. "If you want to leave, I'll take you. If not, I walk out right now." No flourish, no promise, only a choice, something she thought she would never have again. She looked into his gray eyes. No demand, no pressure, no expectation. Only decency, rare enough to strike breath from her chest. I'll go with you," she said, voice quiet but firm. Samuel nodded, paid, and motioned toward the door. "Get your things. We're leaving." In the Texas night, his wagon rolled away from Dustwell. Talia sat beside him, hands trembling. But for the first time in years, she did not feel trapped. She felt like she was stepping out of a cage life had locked around her. Dustwell faded behind them. Ahead, she didn't know yet, but at least it was no longer hell. The road to Barrett Ranch was longer than Talia expected. The wagon rolled across stretches of grassland that seemed to have no end. Night in Texas was wide in a way that unsettled someone like her, someone who had lived in a cramped, rotting house at the edge of town. It felt as if she were entering a world too large, too quiet, too different to trust. Samuel didn't speak much. He kept the reins in hand, glancing over when she curled into herself against the wind. His coat lay between them. She knew it was there for her to take if she needed it. But Talia only touched the edge of it, then pulled her hand back. A man's kindness, especially toward a black woman, always brought caution. By the time they arrived, the sky held no trace of moonlight. The main house of Barrett Ranch appeared first. 2 stories, solid, its wide porch facing the fields. Beyond it were the stables, the barn, and lines of white fencing fading into the dark. A warm glow from the windows fell over the yard. "We're here," Samuel said quietly. His voice held no pride of ownership, only a steady reassurance. Talia stepped down from the wagon, her legs still unsteady. She had never seen land that stretched so far. Freedom that wide often frightened more than confinement. Samuel took a lantern from the hook by the door and walked ahead. Talia followed with measured distance, enough to protect a heart accustomed to harm. He led her around the left side of the main house, where a small cabin stood between 2 old oaks. "This is yours," Samuel said, setting the lantern on the threshold. Talia stopped, unsure whether to step in or turn back, but she drew a breath and moved forward. The door opened. The cabin was small but clean, so clean it startled her. The wooden floor had been scrubbed, the walls untouched by dust. A bed stood against the wall with a hand-woven blanket carrying a faint scent of sun. A small table held a lamp. The iron stove waited in the corner, and a few simple dishes rested on the shelf. Talia stood still. Not because the cabin was pleasant, but because it had been prepared. Not for her specifically, but for someone. And the way everything was set, as if the person arriving needed only to place a bag down and rest, pressed into her in a quiet, unfamiliar way. "You don't have to do anything tonight," Samuel said from the doorway, his voice low and even. "We'll talk about work tomorrow. For now, just rest." She turned. They stood a few steps apart, the lantern light casting soft shadows on his face. Their eyes met briefly, too brief for strangers, yet deeper than it should have been. "Thank you, Mr. Barrett," she said softly. "Samuel is fine," he replied. For the first time, she found it difficult to hold her gaze steady. He gave a small nod, stepped back, and left her with the new cabin. When the door closed, Talia sat on the edge of the bed, hand resting on the blanket, as if afraid to crease it. Everything here felt so far from the life she knew that it unsettled her. True freedom, complete and unquestioned, could feel heavier than chains. But tonight, she had a place to lie down without fear of being woken by shouting. A door she could lock without worrying it would break open. A lamp she could blow out whenever she chose. A breath of peace after years without one. Talia lay down. For the first time since her mother died, she slept without curling into herself in fear. Outside the cabin, Samuel leaned against a porch post of the main house, eyes fixed on the small window where the lamp had just gone dark. He had been sitting there a long while, elbows on his knees, the weight of silence settling around him like an old coat. Not from desire, not from curiosity, but because he understood that the young woman with eyes trained not to cry had stepped out of a life that had buried her. He feared she might panic, feared she might think she was being moved from one owner to another, feared she might mistake him for the men who tried to price her. The Texas wind moved across the yard. A thin moon rose behind the oaks. Samuel stayed there, still as a shadow, until he was sure she must be asleep. Then he stood and walked inside. At the cabin door, Talia shifted in her sleep, unaware that someone had just kept watch over her first night in freedom. The first morning at Barrett Ranch began with a rooster's call echoing from the far end of the pasture. Carried on a clean wind, Talia had never breathed so deeply before. She opened her eyes, taking a few seconds to remember where she was. No smell of whiskey, no shouting, no doors trembling from the draft. Only a small cabin, dawn slipping through the cracks, and a calm so foreign it made her feel like someone new. She washed her face in the basin and stepped outside. The cool air raised a light shiver along her skin, but in a way that eased rather than startled. Following the path toward the main house, she stopped at the doorway left slightly ajar, listening to a strange sizzling inside. When she entered, the sight before her softened her expression. Samuel Barrett, cowboy, ranch owner, the man cowboys in Dustwell avoided, was hunched over a skillet of eggs with an awkwardness that seemed out of place. One hand held the spatula high, the other braced as if afraid of hot oil, and the eggs themselves had been torn to pieces. "I suppose breakfast requires more skill than I remember," Samuel said without turning, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic defeat. "You're ruining the eggs," Talia replied gently, stepping deeper into the kitchen. He looked over then, gray eyes brightening a little at the sight of her. "Up early?" "I'm used to rising before the sun." She moved close enough that their shoulders brushed briefly as she took the spatula from his hand. The touch was light, yet enough for both to pause. Talia suddenly aware of his warmth, Samuel stepping back half a pace as if afraid of standing too near. "Let me," she said, her voice quiet but steadier than before. Samuel watched as she turned the eggs with practiced ease, every motion neat and sure. He rested against the counter, arms folded, unaware of how long he'd been watching her. Breakfast passed in a comfortable silence. Talia sat at the table while Samuel poured the coffee. When she thanked him, he only nodded with a small, reserved smile, his gaze carrying a respect uncommon in this land. After a few bites, Samuel spoke first. "Your mother taught you to cook?" Talia paused. Her mother's name still tightened her chest. But this was the first time someone had asked with such gentleness. She kept the kitchen for a white family in southern Texas, Talia said. She taught me everything: cooking, sewing, keeping a house. She said folks like us stayed safer when things were neat. Samuel nodded. She must have been a good woman. She was everything to me. Her voice softened, and Samuel asked nothing more, as if he knew some wounds shouldn't be touched too soon. To shift the weight of the moment, he spoke about himself, his years carrying a gun in the war, and why he walked away from hired work after returning to Texas. His words were sparse, but something in his eyes held more than he said. "This ranch," he murmured, looking out the window, "is how I started over." For the first time, Talia found herself sitting across from a man who didn't hide his hurt, yet didn't let it control him. After breakfast, Samuel took her to meet Miguel Ortiz and his two sons, Luis and Mateo. They were the heartbeat of the ranch, working hard and teasing one another in equal measure. Miguel laughed when he saw her. "We heard Mr. Barrett finally let someone take care of the house for him." Samuel only gave a small smile, one hand on his hip, but his quick glance toward Talia felt like he was checking that she wasn't overwhelmed. The Ortizes eased her nerves. They were warm, loud, and genuine in ways her own family never had been. Back at the main house, Samuel stood in the doorway, hand resting on the frame. "Talia, there's something you should know," he said, his voice low and clear. "You're free. If you want to stay, I'd be glad for it. If you ever choose to leave, just say the word." It shouldn't have struck her so deeply, but the weight in her chest lifted all at once. "I'll stay," she whispered, "at least until I know where I'm going." Samuel nodded, though a trace of warmth reached his eyes. By afternoon, Talia began cleaning. She dusted the shelves, folded blankets, and set a pot of stew to simmer. The scent drifted through the house, settling into corners that seemed to have slept for too long. Miguel passed by and inhaled. "Well now, this place feels lived in again." Samuel, standing on the porch, heard him. He glanced through the window and saw Talia shaking out a kitchen cloth, the late light catching her shoulders in a pale glow. Nothing had changed much, only a few tidied things, the sound of dishes, the light tread of footsteps. But Samuel felt it clearly. The ranch wasn't the same, and neither was he. The days that followed moved at a slow, steady rhythm, one Talia had never been allowed to feel before. In Dustwell, every day had been strung tight as a drawn bow, fearing her stepfather drunk, fearing the gamblers who came collecting, fearing what trouble might be waiting outside the door. But at Barrett Ranch, morning arrived like a gentle reminder, not a threat. Talia rose early, drew water from the well, and lit the stove before the sun climbed high. Samuel often stood on the porch saddling a horse, sometimes glancing her way. He never interfered with her work, never acted as though he were watching over her. But that brief look was enough to make her feel seen, not inspected. At midday, she worked in the garden with Miguel and his sons. She learned which sprouts should stay, which should be pulled, how to tell the difference between wind in the grass and an animal in the brush. In the afternoons, she stayed in the sitting room, dusting or reading the old book Samuel had left on the table. She read slowly, so slowly it felt as if each line seeped into the worn parts of her life. And in the evening, when the last light burned along the ridge, she often saw Samuel standing at the fence line, eyes set on the sinking sun. Once, without thinking, she stepped out to stand beside him. Neither spoke. They simply watched the sky go red, as if the quiet itself carried what words could not. One morning, as Talia carried a basin of laundry outside, she sensed someone watching. She turned and saw Samuel in the doorway, holding the brown work shirt she'd worn the day before. "Talia," he called, his voice even. She walked toward him. "Did you need something?" He held out the shirt. A thin tear marked the shoulder. "I noticed this. It's nothing serious, but—" He hesitated, unable to find the right words. She realized he was embarrassed. A man like Samuel Barrett, broad-shouldered, steady, shaped by war, was awkward over a small tear. "I can mend it," she said. "Just need a needle and thread." Samuel cleared his throat, almost relieved. "I tried already." He showed her the rough stitching he'd attempted. The thread bent inward, twisted outward, loose in some places and tight in others. Talia let out a quiet laugh. For the first time since arriving, the smile came naturally, not out of politeness, not to hide anything, but because she was genuinely amused. Samuel watched that smile. He didn't step closer, didn't speak, didn't reach for her, but something in the silence between them shifted. Talia removed the old stitches carefully. She knew he hadn't needed to do this. No one expected a ranch owner to bother with a torn shirt on behalf of a housemaid. But the fact that he tried meant something else entirely. A clumsy kind of care, offered without angle or intent. The honesty of it warmed her in a way she couldn't name. A few days later, Rosa Ortiz visited with a basket of bread. Rosa was small and quick-witted, her gaze sharp enough to read a storm. After only a few questions, she seemed fond of Talia already. They talked near the stove while Talia poured tea. Rosa relaxed into the chair as if it were her own home. "Samuel treats you well, huh?" Rosa said, nudging her lightly. Talia nearly dropped the spoon. "Well, the way anyone treats their help?" Rosa laughed. "Not that way. You haven't seen how he looks at you. Like the sky's holding rain, and he's bracing for it." Talia flushed. "You're mistaken." "No," Rosa said with a wink. "He's cold to the whole world. But with you, Lord, you soften him to something dangerous." After Rosa left, Talia stood at the window a long time, watching Samuel turn out the horses. He stroked the chestnut's mane, slow and calm, but every time he looked toward the house, the way he searched for a familiar face tightened her chest. That night, with the sky glowing like embers and the fields sinking into shadow, Talia sat by the hearth sewing, the lamp casting a warm light over her features. Samuel passed through the doorway, pausing a moment, as if to be sure he wasn't intruding. "Talia, are you all right?" She looked up. Just 2 words, but his voice carried such plain sincerity that it unsettled her. "I'm fine," she said softly, realizing it was the first time in years those words were true. Samuel nodded and stepped away without another word. But as he walked off, Talia watched his silhouette fade into the dark and understood that the safety she felt did not come only from the roof over her head. It came from the man disappearing into the night, and that frightened her in a different way. Not fear of him, but fear of the unfamiliar feeling growing quietly inside her. That afternoon, Barrett Ranch held its usual calm. The sun cast long shadows across the fences. The cattle wandered back toward the pens, and the Ortiz boys' laughter carried faintly through the grass. Talia was watering the young vegetable beds near her cabin when a chill traced up her spine, making her look up. 3 riders were coming through the ranch gate. She recognized the first, broad, heavy, wearing a long black coat that carried its own warning. Luther Briggs. Behind him rode Bill Dorsey and Tanner Crow, names spoken in Dustwell only when telling children not to roam alone. Talia stepped back at once and slipped into the main house, closing the wooden door without latching it. She stood behind it, heart pounding, listening as hooves stopped outside the porch. Samuel walked out from the stables, sleeves rolled, dust on his shoulders. He straightened at the sight of Briggs, his expression sharpening. "Mr. Barrett," Briggs called, his voice sweet as syrup but venomous beneath. "I'm here to clear up a few things." Samuel didn't invite them in. He didn't need to. He stood where he was, steady and unyielding. "Say it here." Briggs smirked, the expression thin and poisonous. "You think paying $1,000 settles everything? Heard the girl, Talia, is living real comfortable out here. Looks like you got yourself quite a bargain." Samuel's gaze didn't shift. "I paid to settle a debt, not to own a person." "Sure," Briggs said with a theatrical shrug. "But it's not that simple. Her stepfather signed a statement saying you forced her to leave and share your bed. That sort of thing can go straight to court." Behind the door, Talia clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a sound. Accusations of forced company. Those were the words that could send a black woman straight back into someone's possession. Samuel stepped forward, his shadow cutting the light. "Vernon was drunk. He'll sign anything if there's liquor in reach." Briggs shrugged again. "Courts don't care. We've got his signature. And—" he looked around the ranch, his eyes narrowing. "You've got plenty to lose. Good land, fine house, young girl. I just need 500 more to keep things quiet." "You're extorting me," Samuel said, not as an accusation, but as a fact already proven. "Call it a silence fee," Briggs replied, voice twisting with amusement. The 2 men behind him let their hands drift toward their guns, as if waiting for one wrong breath to break the moment. But Samuel didn't draw. He only looked at Briggs with the cold stillness of someone who had seen real battlefields, places beyond anything men like Briggs could imagine. 500, Briggs repeated. 1 week. Samuel answered with 4 words. "I'm not paying." Silence dropped heavy. Briggs scowled. Dorsey's hand twitched against his holster. Samuel didn't move. And from her place inside, Talia felt something strange. Even if Briggs had brought a dozen men, she knew Samuel wouldn't flinch. Not recklessly, just with the steadiness of someone who had survived dust and death side by side. At last, Briggs let out a short, dry laugh. "Fine. The court can settle it." He jerked his reins, spurred his horse, and rode off in a churn of dust. Dorsey and Crow followed. Only when the hoofbeats faded did the door open. Talia stepped out, hands trembling. "Did you hear what they said?" "I heard," Samuel replied, voice low and certain. "And I know you're scared." Talia swallowed hard. "They could take me back to Dustwell with that claim." "No one is taking you anywhere," Samuel said, his eyes leaving no room for doubt. "Not if you don't want to go." His steadiness, quiet as night settling over the fields, eased the tightness in her chest. He stood a moment longer, thinking through something, then said, "Tonight you sleep in the main house." Talia's eyes widened. "I don't want to be a burden." "The burden he said calmly, is them coming back while you're alone. His voice wasn't harsh, but carried a firmness harder than iron. Talia nodded. That night she lay in the downstairs guest room, the lamplight casting a soft glow along the wall. Samuel slept in the room beside hers, yet she could hardly close her eyes. Each time she nearly drifted, steady footsteps sounded in the hallway. Samuel making his rounds, light enough not to wake anyone, deliberate enough to tell her he was guarding the house. Guarding her. The man the whole town feared for his quiet unpredictability was walking slow circles in the dark because of a girl with nothing but a small suitcase and a past that treated her like property. Talia turned on her side, watching the lamplight flicker. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the dark, or the horses outside, or the wind against the door, because she knew someone was pacing the hallway, someone who had chosen to stand on her side. That noon, Samuel rode out from Barrett Ranch toward Dustwell to meet the sheriff. A dry wind swept across the pasture as he disappeared behind the old oaks. Talia stood on the porch, fingers tightening around her apron, a weight settling on her chest like a dented stone. Miguel and his sons kept close to the cabin, working but watching the road as if afraid she would panic if left alone. They said nothing, but Talia understood. They were trying to steady her. Still, worry clung deep. Years of being treated as something to be controlled had carved that fear into her. She tried to cook, sweep, finish the stitching she left aside the night before, but the needle shook in her hand. Water boiled over without her remembering when she filled the pot. Her mind had followed Samuel the moment he turned his horse up the road. By late afternoon, familiar hoofbeats sounded from afar. Talia stepped onto the porch at once. Samuel dismounted, walking heavier than usual. He didn't speak right away, just removed his gloves, set his hat on the hook, and leaned against the table as if gathering himself before speaking. "Bad news," he said quietly. Talia stood still. A thin fear crept down her spine. "Your stepfather filed the claim. Briggs hired a lawyer from San Angelo. They're trying to drag you back to town by saying you left home under force." Talia's throat tightened. Even the air in the room seemed heavier. "So, they can take me back?" she whispered. Samuel looked up, his eyes dark, deep as the Texas land before a storm. "No, not unless you have no legal say for yourself." He paused. "And there's one way they can't touch you at all." Talia breathed out softly. "What way?" Samuel stepped closer, though he kept enough distance not to corner her. His voice was low, measured, as if each word had been turned over carefully inside him. "Marriage." The wind outside turned a page of the book she'd left on the table. The room fell completely still. Talia looked at him, questions rising behind the quiet. She finally asked the only one she could gather the courage to form. "Only to protect me?" A breath. "Or because you truly want to?" Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, as if holding something that had been locked away too long. When he looked at her again, nothing was hidden. "Talia, from the first night I took you out of Dustwell, I knew I wouldn't be able to stand by and watch you walk out of my life. Not out of duty, not out of obligation, but because I care for you." His voice dropped, almost unsteady. "I love you." The words weren't loud. They touched her like a hand placed gently on wood cracked by weather, soft, but enough to make it whole again. Talia felt something open inside her, as if she had been living on half a breath until now. "Samuel," she said, each word steady, though her heart wasn't. "I love you too. Since the moment you stood outside that saloon and didn't need to raise your voice. Since the moment you protected me without forcing anything on me." He stepped toward her. This time, the space between them disappeared. Samuel lifted his hand, stopping just short of her cheek, as if asking permission. Talia leaned into his palm. That small gesture, gentle, unhurried, made Samuel exhale as though someone had finally unlocked a door he had kept shut for years. He drew her into his arms, lightly enough that a breeze could have undone it. But Talia held him first, pressing her forehead to his chest. His heartbeat was strong and steady, a place she could stay without fear. When his lips found hers, it wasn't urgency. It was two people who had spent years stripped of choice, finally choosing each other freely. They moved slowly toward his room, each step quiet, each glance a question of how far they could go. No pulling, no haste. Only moments soft as warmth passing between two lives shaped by cold. Talia let Samuel touch the curves she once hid like armor. Samuel let her see the part of him he never showed, the place not everyone was allowed to enter. That night wasn't a blaze. It was a lamp flame, small, warm, steady, bright enough to soften the long shadows they carried from their pasts. When dawn approached, a pale pink light spread across the earth. Talia lay in Samuel's arms, her head on his chest, his breath warming her hair. He gently pulled the blanket over her shoulder, the instinct to protect never leaving him. She opened her eyes and watched the morning climb through the window. "You all right?" Samuel asked, voice still thick with sleep. Talia nodded, fingers curling into his shirt. "I've never known a morning this light." Samuel pressed a kiss to her forehead. "From now on," he said, "you don't have to fear the dark." Outside, the sun began to rise. Inside, they stayed as they were, two people who had chosen each other, and the last long night finally behind them. The days after the night, they became each other's, passed with a kind of peace Talia had never dared to imagine. Not the peace of someone resting on soft ground, but the peace of someone almost drowned and pulled to shore, breathing slow, trusting slow, living slow. Samuel rose early every morning. He filled the water buckets, lit the stove, and always left a warm cup of coffee on the kitchen table. Not like a man tending his house, but like he wanted the first thing Talia touched each day to be something easy. She returned the gesture with more careful meals, the hidden stitches repairing his shirts, the quiet steps that softened a house that had once felt cold. No one said anything outright, but the entire ranch began to sense that warmth, like the smell of earth after the first rain of the season. Miguel noticed first. One afternoon, splitting wood behind the barn, he cast a brief look toward Samuel, showing Talia how to check a saddle. "El patrón has changed," Miguel murmured to Carlos. The boy only grinned. "A good woman can shift the weather inside a man." Samuel didn't hear it, but Talia's ears burned hot to her collar. Still, peace did not mean safety. News from Dustwell kept drifting in like dry wind. The court date would be set soon. Briggs had hired more men, and unfamiliar faces were seen along hill country trails, appearing and vanishing before anyone asked questions. Once, while Talia hung laundry on the line, she saw two riders stop on the ridge north of the ranch. They didn't move, didn't speak, only watched. she told Samuel that evening. He laid a hand on her shoulder, his gaze shifting as if weighing options. I'll have Miguel run extra patrols, but don't be afraid. No one gets onto this land unless I allow it. It wasn't a threat, more like the main beam steadying the roof when the wind begins to rise. Talia tried not to let fear take up all the space in her mind. She learned everything the ranch demanded: stacking grain, mixing salve for the horses' scrapes, checking fox traps, even trying to ride an old mare after Samuel suggested it. He walked beside the horse, one hand on the reins, the other brushing her ankle to correct her posture. A light touch, yet it warmed her skin like sun after cold days. "Breathe," he said. "Let the mare feel you trust her." She did. The mare stepped forward, slow but steady, and Samuel stayed close, ready to catch her if she leaned. When she glanced down, she met his eyes, nothing hidden there. And that was the moment she realized. Someone was loving her by not claiming her. That afternoon, she sat on the porch with her half-finished embroidery in her lap. Far off, Samuel rode ahead of the cattle, the sun turning his figure dark against the fading gold. She knew then her heart had chosen its home, but choosing peace had never stopped a storm from finding its way. One evening, Miguel arrived late and knocked on the main house door, his face drawn tight, like a man who heard a gunshot behind him in the desert. "Patron," he said quietly. "I saw Briggs's men below the eastern ridge, horses hidden among the mesquite." Samuel wasn't surprised. It was as if he had been expecting it. "Thank you," he answered. "The closer we get to the hearing, the more reckless they'll be." Talia listened from the kitchen, a sharp ache running through her chest. When Miguel left, Samuel stepped inside and saw her standing there, hands trembling. "What do you think they'll do?" she asked. Samuel came closer, not abruptly, not forcefully. He brushed the back of her hand with his thumb, simple, steady, enough to pull her back from the edge of her fears. "They want to scare you," he said, his voice warm like the fire cracking in the stove. "But you're not alone, and I won't let anyone take you from this place." She rested her head against his chest, listening to the deep, steady rhythm, like a promise made without words. That night, after the oil lamp was lit, Samuel sat in the front room repairing a bridle while Talia mended his worn gloves. Sometimes their eyes met across the glow. No rush like that first night, only something deeper, quieter. Silence, but full, not empty. Outside, a strong wind swept across the tall grass, carrying the first hint of something approaching. Talia didn't know what the court would bring, or how far Briggs would go, but for the first time in her life, she wanted to stay somewhere until the very end. She wanted to stay because this place was not just a home. It was because the man sitting a few steps away was the home her heart had finally found. That morning, Dustwell lay under a light veil of dust as Samuel and Talia rode into town. On the way, Samuel was quieter than usual, while Talia gripped the reins, keeping her breath steady. It wasn't Briggs she feared. It was the thought of being pulled back into her old life, where endurance had been her only skill. The courthouse stood inside a 2-story wooden building, plain yet solemn with its whispers, its doors shutting, the drag of boots on floorboards. People gathered as if the hearing were the season's latest spectacle. When Talia stepped in, the murmurs stopped. A young black woman, fine-featured, walking beside a well-known rancher. Such a sight stirred more curiosity than the dry months ever could. Samuel walked close to her. He didn't touch her, but his presence wrapped around her like an unseen arm. Inside, Briggs stood with his lawyer, a smooth-faced man in a black vest whose smile curved like a blade. The saloon owner from the Salty Bell lurked nearby, clothes still carrying the scent of cheap liquor. And her stepfather, Vernon Hollister, hair wild, eyes red, uncertain whether from fear or drink. Judge McHale took his seat. The hearing began. Briggs opened with a voice slick as oil. Talia was forced from her home in the night to serve Barrett's personal interests. His lawyer held up the statement Vernon had signed. Vernon stared around, then lowered his eyes. He threatened me, he said. Barrett forced her out. The room tilted for Talia. The man who had eaten away her labor and tried to sell her like stock now lied as easily as he poured whiskey. Samuel tilted his head slightly toward her, just enough for the floor to steady beneath her feet. The saloon owner took the stand next, his slurred voice sharpened by intent. I saw the girl leave town that night, following Barrett like she had no choice. She looked scared. The room buzzed. Then Samuel rose. He didn't pound the table or raise his voice. He only looked directly at the judge, and the stillness in him quieted everyone else. Your Honor, I paid $1,000 to clear Vernon Hollister's debt, not to purchase a person. I took Talia because otherwise she would have been sold to men who trade women across the border. I have the freedom contract she signed, fully aware, fully willing. Samuel's lawyer, Mr. Brennan, presented the document. Her signature was small, trembling, but unmistakably her own. Ms. Reed, the judge asked, do you wish to speak? Talia stood. Her hands trembled, but her gaze did not shift. She spoke plainly, about Vernon's debts, about Briggs, about the threats, about being auctioned before 4 men. She did not cry, did not raise her voice. She simply told the truth in a tone thin and clear as thread. Dustwell fell silent. When she reached the part where Samuel asked whether she wanted to leave with him, she looked at him. That look carried a straight line between their hearts. Mr. Barrett gave me a choice, she said. He was the first man who did not treat me as something to own. A ripple of hushed emotion spread across the room. Briggs flushed red. His lawyer shot to his feet in protest. The saloon owner tried to mask his unease. The judge lifted a hand. Given the conflicting testimonies and the presence of valid legal documentation, I will postpone judgment until next week. Both parties will maintain order until then. The gavel struck, heavy as a dropped stone. When they stepped out of the courthouse, the sun was low on the horizon. Dustwell's main street bustled with eyes, curious, sympathetic, or edged with bias that wasn't fully hidden. Samuel extended his hand. He didn't take hers. He simply offered it. And waited. That was what tightened Talia's chest the most. She placed her hand in his. Not tightly. Not pulling. Just a touch light as wind across open grass. Samuel led her through the busy street, every step pulling her farther from the past. Briggs wanted to drag her back into. Talia looked over at him, the evening light on his strong face and in his eyes a gentleness like earth after rain. Thank you, she whispered. Samuel gave her hand a faint, steadying squeeze. You won't face this alone. The Texas wind rose from the south, bringing the scent of dirt and storm. But for the first time, Talia didn't bow her head against it, because now she had someone walking beside her. That Texas afternoon began with a strange stillness. Not the stillness of peace, but the kind that settles when the land itself holds its breath, waiting for something ill to break loose. Talia was stacking firewood by the stove when Miguel ran in, breathless, his shirt streaked with road dust. "Patron, Briggs's men. I saw them on the South Ridge. 3, maybe 4. They're not here to talk." Samuel looked straight at Miguel. He didn't ask a single question. He only nodded, slow and solid, like a stone sinking to a well's bottom. Then he turned to Talia. "Inside. Now," he said, his voice low and sharp as wind cutting along a porch beam. A cold line traveled down Talia's spine. Not because Samuel was angry. He had never been angry with her. But because of the look in his eyes, a look like the kind of darkness people still trusted when lost inside it. She obeyed, but she had barely taken a few steps when hoofbeats rose. 1, then 2, then more. She turned. Briggs rode at the front, his heavy face slick with sweat, his eyes narrow and venomous. Behind him, 4 men, guns hanging loose at their sides, their posture leaving no doubt of their purpose. "Barrett!" Briggs roared. "You think the court's gonna save you? I want the girl back, now." Samuel stepped off the porch, unhurried, unshaken. He stood on the sun-burned ground, shoulders squared, back straight, his gaze darkening like the sky before a storm. "Talia doesn't belong to you," he said. Briggs let out a laugh that scraped the air. "Not mine, but the court's. All I gotta do is haul her back to town. Nobody needs to know what happens on the way." 2 of his men chuckled, the ugly kind meant to frighten. Miguel and his sons stepped forward beside Samuel. No one drew a gun, but their hands settled on their belts, the thin edge between life and death resting on the rise and fall of breath. "Talia, inside," Samuel repeated. She backed toward the house, shaken, but she didn't run. Only when her back reached the doorway did she turn. She managed 2 steps before one of Briggs's men spurred his horse forward. "Grab the girl!" He never touched her. Samuel was already there, blocking the doorway, faster than the shout itself. He seized the man's reins and tore them downward. The horse stumbled. The rider nearly fell. Samuel said nothing, but the look in his eyes made even Briggs's followers shift back. Silence tightened like a stretched drum. Briggs spat into the dirt. "Hand the girl over, or I burn your barn, tear your fences, and leave this ranch so empty it can't raise a chicken." Samuel stepped forward. "1 inch more," he said, "and you'll learn why they used to call me Ghost Barrett on the battlefield." A dry stalk of grass flipped in the wind. No one moved. Then pounding hoofbeats shattered the stillness. A group rode in from the north. Sheriff Peterson at the lead, with 2 deputies and 3 Dustwell townsfolk carrying hunting rifles. "Stop right there," the sheriff barked. "Briggs, enough. You're trespassing and threatening lives. I can arrest you on the spot." Briggs swung his horse around, face draining of color. How'd you know?" Miguel gave a tight smile. "Been watching you skulk around for days. I told the sheriff this morning." Sheriff Peterson leveled a cold stare at Briggs. "Word is you've had men prowling all over hill country. The court hasn't ruled yet, but the law still stands." Briggs seethed, but with rifles pointed and the sheriff blocking his path, he didn't dare move closer. "You'll pay for this," he hissed. "The court's not done." He yanked the reins and drove his horse down the trail, dust rising thick enough to dull the sun. His men followed, glancing back with eyes full of threat. Only when the hoofbeats faded did Talia finally breathe deep. Her hands trembled as if the wind still battered them. Samuel walked in, stopping directly before her. "Talia," he said quietly, "are you hurt?" She shook her head. Tears gathered, not from fear, but from being defended in a way she had never known. Samuel touched her cheek, lightly, as if too much pressure might bruise her. "They'll be back," he said, his voice deep as if spoken from the center of his chest. "I know," she whispered, lifting her gaze to him, "but I'm not afraid anymore." The evening wind swept through, carrying the scent of scorched earth and wild grass. In the west, clouds gathered, thick, gray, rising fast. Briggs wasn't finished. He had only pulled back to shape something darker. But in that moment, standing on the open ground before Barrett Ranch, Talia knew one thing with clarity. If the storm came, she would not run. Because she stood beside the one man even darkness stepped aside for. The bad news arrived on a morning so ordinary that no one would have guessed it could mark the end of an entire chapter of the past. Miguel brought it. He came with the hill country courier, his face heavy the way summer skies look before a dust storm breaks. "I heard it in Dustwell," he said, laying his hat on the table. "About Vernon, Talia's stepfather." Talia was at the stove stirring a pot of soup. At the sound of that name, her hand stalled, not from grief but from memory, the kind she had folded away so many times, yet still rose like raw alcohol in the air. Miguel drew a long breath. "Briggs roughed him up, badly. Seems Vernon admitted the forged papers to someone he shouldn't have." Talia felt her stomach tighten. Not for Vernon, the man who had sold her as if she were a commodity, but for something else. If Vernon fell apart, the whole rotten house of her past would collapse with him. "Is he alive?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. Miguel nodded. "He ran. Likely left Texas. Nobody knows where he's gone." Talia set the ladle down and stood still for a long time. A distant shadow seemed to fade. A door closing that she didn't have to push shut herself. Samuel stood nearby. He didn't interrupt. Didn't offer comfort too quickly. He understood there are wounds a person must stand beside before accepting they're finally gone. But Vernon's news was only the first half. "And Briggs?" Samuel asked. Miguel gave a thin smile. "He caused trouble at the saloon. Fired a shot at a customer. Lucky no one died. The sheriff's digging into it. Heard there's a warrant about to land on him." Talia heard Samuel let out a quiet, weighted breath. "Then he won't have the time to come after us," Samuel said. Miguel nodded. "That's my thinking. Briggs is busy keeping his own hide intact." Talia listened to each word as though hearing the earth split open, not to swallow her, but to release the roots that once held her down. When the sun climbed higher, the ranch returned to its usual rhythm. Samuel checked the stables, Miguel took his sons to chop wood, and Talia swept the floors and hung the new embroidered cloth she had been working on for weeks. But inside her, something was loosening, like a stream long clogged finally breaking free. Quiet but strong enough that she had to stop on the porch and draw a long breath. From where she stood, hill country stretched out in wide blue-green and gold, the wind lifting soft dust into the air. Beyond that, the old oaks stood dark under the noon sun. She had walked roads that blistered her feet, faced hearts that wanted to crush her more than shield her. She had believed she was born only to endure, to accept whatever life was thrown at her. But here on the wooden porch of Barrett Ranch, she understood something no one had ever told her. The past can die, and not every death is worth mourning. She placed her hand on the porch rail, her fingers brushing the rough wood. The midday light touched her skin, deepening the warm honey tone her mother once called the color of the earth that feeds the world. She heard footsteps behind her. Samuel. He didn't question her, didn't speak. He simply stood beside her, close enough that their hands nearly touched, with no need to reach. A small wind swept through, lifting her embroidered cloth before letting it fall again. Everything seemed ordinary, and that very ordinariness eased something in her chest. "Are you all right?" Samuel asked softly. Talia nodded, her gaze still on the field. "I think my old life just collapsed. Completely." Samuel didn't rush to reassure her. He let the silence settle, as if giving her room to hear something new taking shape inside herself. After a long moment, she added, "But maybe that's a good thing." Samuel looked at her. No surprise in his eyes. Only the slow, deep understanding that made her heart soften. "There's nothing pulling me back anymore," she said. "Nothing left tying me to where I never belonged." Samuel leaned slightly, letting his shoulder touch hers. A small touch, but enough to tell her that everything had lined up where it should. The Texas wind kept blowing. The old storms had thinned. The old shadows had run. And her past, finally, was no longer something she had to carry. Before her lay fields stretching to the far edge of day, and a future she had never dared to name. Until now. The wedding was set for a June afternoon, the season when Texas seemed to breathe slower, when sunlight thinned into gentle lines across the grasslands, and the wind moved only enough to touch the old oaks. Talia stood in Rosa's small room, where the window was open wide and the evening light poured in. Rosa leaned close, tightening the last stitch of the simple white dress. No lace, no trim, no ornament. Just a clean line of fabric that fit her shape, quiet and steady, the same way she had stepped into her new life. Slow, clear, and true. "You look like the first light of morning," Rosa said, resting her hand briefly on Talia's cheek. Talia smiled, a soft, steady smile that surprised even her. When she stepped onto the porch, Samuel was already waiting. He wore a clean white shirt, buttoned to the top, his hair neatly combed, his tie pulled just tight enough to mark the breadth of his shoulders. But none of that mattered beside the way he looked at her. It wasn't the stunned look he had the night he first saw her at the Dustwell saloon. It wasn't the worried one he carried when Briggs prowled around the ranch. This time, his gaze held a warm light, like a man who had found the thing his life had been missing but never knew how to name. Talia stopped. Her hand trembled, not from fear, but because her heart was standing in front of its own home. The ceremony took place on the front porch of Barrett Ranch, where the old boards had once heard wind, hooves, and anxious footsteps, now replaced by music from Rosa's small Mexican guitar and quiet laughter floating across the yard. Miguel stood as officiant, his voice deep and steady as earth. "Talia Reed," he said, "you came here running from something. Today you stand here as someone chosen." Talia bowed her head. Tears rimmed her eyes but did not fall. "Samuel Barrett," Miguel continued, "you lived alone on these plains like a ghost. Today you've found your light." Samuel smiled, a rare kind of smile Talia suspected existed only for her. They joined hands, two hands that fit, trusted, and already knew the hardest parts of each other. "Do you want to say something?" Samuel asked. Talia had not prepared vows. She simply looked at him, into eyes the color of warm soil at dusk, and said, "You gave me what no one else ever did, the right to choose. Today, I choose you." Samuel tightened his hold and lowered his forehead to hers. "I chose you long ago," he whispered, quiet enough for only the two of them. Then they kissed, not the grand kiss of loud promises, but the quiet one of two people who had once feared losing everything and now dared to place their hearts in each other's hands. Soft, slow, deep, a grace more than a gesture. Applause rose. Rosa cried. Miguel laughed. Rosa's lively music filled the warm air of late afternoon. Talia danced with Samuel in a simple folk step. His hand rested at her back, hers on his shoulder, not perfect, not in rhythm, but honest. At one point, Samuel dipped his head to hers and murmured, "You're so beautiful today, it feels like a dream." Talia leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart, strong and grounded as the land itself. When the celebration faded, the wind cooled. The sky darkened to deep blue, and thin stars began to appear. Samuel led her to the small cabin he had been fixing up for weeks. Their wedding night was not marked by flowers or noise, only by two people long shaped by fear learning to touch with trust. Samuel lifted her face with a warm hand, as if asking once more if she was certain. Talia placed her hand over his, her answer needing no words. They belonged to each other again that night, not hurried, not bold, not to prove anything, only to know that at last they had found the place where their hearts could rest. Near dawn, Talia lay in Samuel's arms, her head on his chest. Outside, the Texas plains breathed steadily in the cool wind. For the first time in her life, she woke not to fear, but to the knowledge that she was beginning a family, and a new life stretched wide before her. The years passed without noise. They came the way early winds move across the plains, carrying dust, sunlight, and the slow rhythm of a Texas where nothing hurries. Barrett Ranch changed with every season. What had once been wind-worn ground and the tired steps of horses became a place that truly lived. Wider barns, livestock born year after year, new fences stretching all the way to the foot of the hill. Samuel still rose before dawn, set the coffee pot on the stove, then walked the yard with the habitual calm that had settled into his bones. But the ranch changed for real when the first pair of small footsteps ran across the porch. Then the second, and the third. 3 children grew up between wind and laughter. Children with the deep eyes they inherited from Samuel and the warm honey-colored skin of Talia. The oldest loved riding, the middle one shaped clay with quiet focus, and the youngest clung to their mother as if the world began and ended in Talia's arms. Miguel often said, "This ranch used to have only dirt and wind. Now it breathes like a family." Talia only smiled. She had become the heart of Barrett Ranch, not by plan, but by the quiet work of her hands. Every meal, every sun-warmed blanket, every small embrace for a crying child, every lamp she lit when Samuel returned late, each was a small thing, but they warmed the place the way sunlight soaks into old wood. In hill country, people knew Samuel as the quiet man who never turned away from anyone in need. But alongside his reputation, they knew Talia, the woman with gentle eyes that never meant weakness, the one behind so many decisions that helped the ranch stand, grow, and stay alive. Briggs had long vanished from Texas. No one mentioned him anymore. Some said he had slipped into Oklahoma and fallen into worse trouble there. And Vernon, Talia's stepfather, never came back, like a night shadow swept away by dawn. Talia needed no more answers. She no longer carried those shadows. Her new life was larger than the old wounds had ever been. One late summer evening, the sun dropped behind the horizon, washing the fields in a burnt gold light. Samuel and Talia sat on the long porch bench. Far out in the yard, the three children chased each other through the grass, their footsteps running in soft lines. No one spoke for a while. Only the wind moved under the eaves, lifting thin dust like smoke. At last Samuel said, "Do you ever regret anything?" His voice was low, as if he feared waking something that had long lain quietly inside her. Talia turned toward him, her hair tied back, still lifted in the evening breeze. She saw the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, not the lines of fatigue, but of a man who had laughed more than he had hurt. She reached for his hand. Their fingers wove together, just as they had years ago, but steadier now. "No," she said, her voice soft but firm as the ground beneath them. "Every pain led me here." Samuel lowered his head and pressed a quiet kiss to the back of her hand, a simple gesture, one she knew he reserved for only one person in his life. The children's laughter rose again. The youngest fell, scrambled back up, and ran on, reaching for the last fragments of light. The older two followed, their shadows stretching long across the field. Talia watched them and felt her heart so full it bordered on overflowing. This was not the life she had once dreamed of. It was more. A life built not from luck or chance, but from the work of two hands, steady, patient, and loving. The sun sank completely. A thin blanket of dusk settled over the ranch. Samuel slipped his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him. Ahead of them, three small figures kept running, three thin rays of light leading the way forward. Behind them lay everything that had once hurt, once threatened, once tried to pull them down, now fading like the evening shadows. And in the space between those two worlds, they sat together, hands joined, watching the life they had built grow from the footsteps of their children. A life they made with their own hands, strong, quiet, and beautiful in its own way.